We're continuing today to read chapter 2, which has been about, and we saw the last paragraph we read was about the connection between civic virtue and measurement, right? I'll reread it. The civic virtues on which we have touched above are a principle of order and beauty in us, as long as we remain passing our life here. They ennoble us by setting bound and measure to our desires and to our entire sensibility and dispelling false judgment. We saw how that's like the Protagoras is in the background, where measurement allows us to dispel false judgment, and in general, the arguments in Plato about the connection between virtue and measure, hitting the right criterion. And this by sheer efficacy of the better, by the very setting of bounds, by the fact that the measured is lifted outside of the sphere of the unmeasured and the lawless. And we saw how the sphere of the unmeasured, there's this image of that in the Statesman, the sea of unlikeness, which is going to come up now in the next paragraph. So is that there?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to then continue reading?
Yeah. So let me um I was reading in the guide also yesterday there was he was saying something like someone swimming in the sea, someone without some virtue or knowledge, I'm not sure, swimming in the sea of highly of matter, something like that. So
Right.
it sounds like the same language. So we're saying that there is the basic like connection is that the even the civic virtue has this kind of likeness, which is one way, right? That was the previous thing. It's one way, but it takes its form from the order, which is in the intelligible, right? As an archetype, not as two things that are like to each other, but as one thing that is like to the other one, and the other one is only the source or the
Right. That's talking about the house analogy, right?
yeah.
So it's like building a house, yeah.
Okay. Now, um, and maybe the point of the civic virtues being a measure is sort of to show that virtues are like what they are is a kind of abstracting, like a kind of abstract order or a correct amount. It's not like, not sure what else you could say it is, but I'm sure
Well,
like,
it's also that they, like, if you define the virtues as a measure, then you presuppose something that needs to be measured. You presuppose something
okay.
continuous. Yeah. So now we go on from and
So both that the virtues are, so they're measuring the unmeasured thing, which is the, um,
exactly. And so this is part of what then distinguishes it from the ideal, from the paradigm, right? Because of course the paradigm it doesn't have a matter. It's that's the
mhm.
yeah.
And further, right? That's where we are. And further, these civic virtues measured and ordered themselves. So they're measured. So I guess they are measured by something above them, or they are measure, I'm not sure. And acting as a principle of measure to the soul, which is a matter to their forming.
Right.
Um,
So this is right. So there are a couple of things here. So first of all, there's this idea that th there's like this idea that they measure themselves or they order themselves. So they're a source of order for themselves. They don't then need a further source of order. Second is so right. One moment. Let me. Um, yeah. Or right, so that's one way of taking it. This is a middle verb, horisthesis. So it could also be that it could also be taken in a passive way. So it can be that they are measured, um, insofar as they are measures for the soul, which is as matter. Um, Now that's the second thing to observe here, which is the idea of the soul as matter. That's something that Plotinus is much more comfortable saying, right? That the soul somehow has a formless element in it, and, and that needs the forming actu of the virtues. This is um Proclus would be much more careful about that. I mean, soul's still okay, but like but in principle he thinks that the soul, it's not, since it's not a body, it doesn't really strictly have any matter. And the so he would specify that it's something like the connection of the soul to the body or something that's what needs measure. And but this reflects in general Plotinus's view. So he has this two-step view of procession, where he has this view that, from the cause, an immediate effect emanates that is somehow formless, and but then by turning to the cause, it gets its form. Right? So like nous comes from unity as this formless nous, but then when it turns to unity, really becomes nous, and becomes the world of the forms. The soul moves away, proceeds from nous as just this, as it were, formless life. But then when it turns towards nous, it becomes for soul, and turning towards nous is here, getting the virtues. Um, so that's something to underline here. Something typical of Plotinus.
Uh, right, but the for like matter here, matter here doesn't literally mean matter. It just means like
It means some kind of potentiality, right? Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And I mean, at least for the soul, I don't know about the news, we have to say something like that because virtues are forming something, right? There is a person there before he has virtues.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we have to say something like that. I'm just, yeah, but Proclus would be like more careful on how to formulate it, because he'd specify that it's only the soul in contact with the body or something like that.
Well, something like the life that we have here, or normal meaning of the word life is that.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, and so that's what the civic virtues are. So they
Right,
are the measure, either they measure themselves or by something else, but they act as a measure, as a principle of measure to the soul.
right.
Are like to measure. So these civic virtues, then these like, which are measured and the measure are like to the measure. They are alike. They're akin to, right? They're akin to
Yeah,
the measure reigning in the overworld,
right. Overworld here is just there,
right?
intelligible. Yeah.
Um, which is what? Um, and they carry a trace of that highest good in the supreme. So the good,
Right. So the supreme and the overworld are both there in the Greek. And so there's a measure there. That's probably the idea of the intelligible house, right? Something like that. And they have a trace of the what is best there. So maybe he could be saying the same thing twice. Or, maybe the idea is like the trace doesn't need likeness, and so maybe the similarity is to nous or to something in nous, but the trace is a relationship to the good itself, right?
Hmm. Um, Four. Um, while utter measurelessness is brute matter and wholly outside of likeness,
Hmm.
matter or brute like final matter, the first matter, would be entirely unlike and or
Right.
outside, not connected to the form or the good. Any participation in ideal form produces some corresponding degree of likeness to the formless being, the formless being there. So again, to the nous. And
Yes.
participation goes by nearness, the soul nearer than the body, therefore closer akin, participates more fully and shows a godlike presence, almost cheating us into the delusion that in the soul we see God entire. So this is the way in which the men of civic virtue attain likeness.
Right. So yeah, the outer measureless, the being wholly outside of likeness suggests this thing of being, as it were, something that's entirely particular, right? That's like the threat of the ocean of or the sea of unlikeness. And right. And the uh, so that's like what you have to avoid. And through the participation in ideal form, right? So through the um, similarity, you become um, more similar to the formless being there. Um, it's that's not necessarily. I mean, there's you can think about that the things up there are formless insofar as they don't have, they're not form matter composites. So there's one use of formless that's like saying that heat is not hot. So it's not a hot thing. Right? So the forms are formless in that sense. Um, but the the Gerson translators think this is again a reference to the good itself, because the good itself is beyond form.
Hmm.
And that would then make this clause parallel to the previous one, where we both had, on the one hand, the measure there, which is the intelligible, and then also the best there, which would be the good.
Hmm.
Um, yes. And um, and then there's this thing about how the soul is nearer to the body and is nearer to the good than the body, nearer to the nearer to there than the body. It's more separate, and therefore it's more similar to it. Um, this thing about the soul being similar that recalls one of the arguments in the Phaedo that well, for the immortality of the soul, it has an affinity with the forms, so it should be eternal like them. It should be simple like them, and simple things can't be destroyed. And and then there's this thing that it seems to give us uh, all of God, and but implicitly it doesn't. So this raises, this is goes back to the question of what what God are we trying to imitate, or what divine thing are we trying to imitate?
Meaning
Uh,
that the soul is not like all of God.
right. The soul is not like all of God because there's at least nous, right, beyond it,
Hmm.
and um, but
But it
but
is like in this way that we're just describing right now.
right. Um, and right, and when he says, this, right, that the soul is this idea that when we think of soul, we see God entire. there are passages in Plato where it seems like the gods are souls or are like souls. So specifically, the Phaedrus, right? The soul is the source of all motion, and the gods are depicted, it seems, as souls. They also have chariots and things like that. And also in the laws, it seems like the gods are souls and the soul of the world and things. There is still nous beyond it. So there's like, of course, and in the Republic, there's even the idea of the good beyond the intelligible things. So there's Platonic warrant um, saying there's something beyond the soul that is divine. The soul isn't all, but these are passages that can give you this impression. And it's also like the maybe he's also thinking of Stoicism, right? That stops it, that for the Stoics, God is the self-moving principle, right? And so that, although they don't even get to soul because they think the self-moving principle is a body, so far as it's a self-moving principle, that's a definite definition of soul. So like there are people who stop at soul and think that that's all there is, and implicitly they think that the civic virtues are all there is, right?
Okay, and he is giving us a kind of explanation of their mistake. So, since it's true that the soul, or at least the soul which has virtues, like the not the matter soul here, right?
Right.
Um, the formed soul is more divine than the body, or more akin to the nous or to the good than the body. That so some people wouldn't know how to differentiate between this more and like everything,
Right.
like something like someone who like I don't know. If someone has a little more money than you, then you think they have infinite money or something like that, which is something.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of a proposition we saw in Proclus. I think it's 95. The one that the higher principles always seem infinite to the lower ones,
Hmm.
right?
Okay.
Um,
Okay, yeah, we could, so then we could say that it's like really true. Like there's all these kinds of like some mystic would come and say, I am the truth or something like that. The Sufi said that. And then some philosopher could come and tell him, yeah, you're the truth, but what you mean by that is some very small level of the truth because you can't be identical to the good or something. They could be identical to some thing that you, maybe because you're not educated, think is the whole, but is not really the whole. Although it feels like, I understand why it feels like that to you.
right. Yeah. I wonder if Plotinus has is someone specific in mind that he's thinking of doing that. Like that he's like but I'm not sure if he is. He was, there were like mystical movements that he around him that he was critical of, like the Gnostics specifically. But and also I guess Christians, but I'm not sure if he has that in mind in this passage.
Okay. But the important thing for virtue is just that since all virtue is a kind of form, or like I said, a kind of measure, which is the
Hmm.
same, sort of the same thing as a form, or at least one kind of form, I'm not sure. Um, then by virtue of being measured, you are more alike to the thing that measures it really, which is the nous, I guess, really.
Right.
And
So this it does two things, the measure. On the one hand, it explains that this is still bound to the body somehow. And on the other, it also points to something higher that's disconnected entirely from the body, which is the nous. Right. And and so the analysis of virtues, of civic virtue as measurement, like puts it in its place and relativizes it.
Mhm.
Um, Now, in the next, this will
But
become
so
clear.
the problem is with this would be something like that. The only thing, like he says, the soul without virtue or this unlike matter or something like that, Um, I mean, that would only be entirely true for, I don't know, for like something really entirely unformed, which sort of doesn't exist. Like anything, any chair is also somewhat divine because it's not a piece of wood, and the wood is also divine because it's not whatever things woods are made out of, and so on.
So Plotinus, so like you can say, okay, even if it doesn't exist separately, we
You got stuck.
and um so okay.
Got
But
stuck, Chris.
you could hear me.
Now I do, yeah.
Okay. Um so so even if it doesn't exist on its own, you can there are theories that say they're pure matter, and Plotinus is one of these people. And in some texts, I think on matter, he identifies matter with evil, and that's something that will like Proclus will later criticize because he thinks, well, this seems to be this seems dualistic. How do you ground it in the good? Um, but so Plotinus is, someone who does think there is, in some sense, this total measurelessness. Um, and he's not someone like so there are Platonists who thought that there was an evil world soul, in part because of the statesman, but also because of like the Timaeus. Timaeus talks about this um, chaotic motion that exists before the world. And then they put this together with the idea that all change, all motion has to come from a soul. They said also if there's this disordered motion before the creation of the world, because there's this evil soul, and the creation of the world is actually something like the education of this soul, right? So that it moves properly. And you can think that, the statesman portrays the relationship between the God and the world, as it were, as an educational relationship as well. So he's not. Aquinas doesn't have an evil world soul theory; he has an evil matter theory. But anyway, so these are like um, what would concretely be meant by this totally measureless or chaotic thing, right?
Okay, but then when
It
I
would be
come
like
to someone, yeah, you got
it
stuck
would be
again.
like the life of the life that sustains as it were, like the changing, the constant change that underlies the things we perceive, if abstracted from all the form.
Okay, but if someone says, if I am not virtuous, am I that? I mean, it seems like, for example, someone who has a planned out evil should be better than someone who is just randomly doing evil because he is more formed or more measured. Maybe you'll say that that's the opposite. It's like a immeasure or like a extreme or something like that. But I mean, he's like, we're trying to tell, like Plato is here in the beginning text that we started from. Plato is telling us that there's a better reason to be good than the old wives' tales, which is like to follow the divine paradigm. And I mean, it seems like the divine paradigm here is a lot broader than what we call moral virtue. Like it's literally, besides this
Um,
goes also to like lower, like even before civic virtue, there's something like an architect is really uh, making pieces of wood into a form. So he's also becoming escaping the world by that or something.
right. So it is true that this is, I mean, both things are true. On the one hand, it is true that the general idea of excellence is broader than the idea of moral excellence, of moral virtue. And even the artisan and the architect participate in this. However, um, and so like the evil expert, you can say he has more form, but he lacks the excellence of being a good human being, or the excellence of a human being, qua human being. Um, and in that sense, he would be, um, you know, in that sense, he is worse than the person who just accidentally does something wrong, or maybe not accidentally on purpose, but um, like without um so you were contrasting the person who is wicked and has a plan, and the person who is wicked but doesn't have a plan. He hasn't put much thought into it. It's just, as it were, a passing action or something. And so that person is better because they have more of the excellence for human beings, although the other person has other kinds of excellence, right? Excellence in strategy and things like that.
Hmm.
So yeah,
But
and
that's really that those are really evil souls which exist.
well, yeah, I mean they can I mean, in principle, they can become better.
Yeah. I mean,
They're, but,
no, I mean to
but
say, even if there's
there
no
are,
evil world souls, there are evil human souls in the sense that
oh
people
yeah,
have this organization which is chaotic or
yeah, yeah. Or they lack the organization. They they can't measure their pleasures and pains, and so they're not temperate. They act on their immediate impulses, or a number of things, in ways that they're not measured fully. They don't.
hmm.
Um, but so, but there's a whole other kind of virtue, which he's going to talk about now in the third chapter, which is what he calls, which he connects with purification, and that they'll go into the um, Platonic tradition. We'll later talk about the purificatory virtues. And I have a PowerPoint with background on that.
Okay. Can you give me just 1 second? I'm just
Sure.
gonna.
Okay, so let's share this purificatory virtue. Okay, so here you see the philosopher being released from his shackles. Um, and so let's start with general question like what is purification? General, religious ideas of purity are mentioned right at the beginning of the Phaedo when he's explaining why Socrates' trial was delayed, right? So the day before the trial as it happened, the prow of the ship that the Athenians sent to Delos had been crowned with garlands. Which ship is that? It is the ship in which the Athenians say Theseus once sailed to Crete, taking with him the two lots of 7 victims. He saved them and was himself saved. The Athenians vowed then to Apollo, so the story goes, that if they were saved, they would send a mission to Delos every year. And from that time to this, they would send such an annual mission to the god. They have a law to keep the city pure while it lasts, and no execution may take place once the mission has begun until the ship has made its journey to Delos and returned to Athens. And this can sometimes take a long time if the winds delay it. The mission begins when the priest of Apollo crowns the prow of the ship, and this happens, I say, the day before Socrates' trial. That is why Socrates was in prison for a long time between his trial and execution. Um, so this brings up a very basic idea of purity, that purity means avoiding contact with death, right? So you can't murder people, you can't execute people either during if you don't want to become polluted, and um, you know, purity and on a basic level means, be just clean, being clean. And Plato will use the word to talk about like the pure forms or pure thought, meaning the form just by itself or thought just by itself without the senses. We'll get to passages like that. But there's also these religious backgrounds where the idea is that there are certain prescriptions that you have to be pure in order to have contact with the gods, in order to engage in some cultic activity. and uh, things like contact with death, and there are also references to things like sexual intercourse that they make you impure, and you have to cleanse yourself in different ways. There are even, for certain people, like for the Pythagoreans, eating meat or a bean makes you impure, and you have to purify yourself. The Pythagoreans will come back to because then that has to do with transmigration. But so there are many ideas of this connected with purity, and often, one context where that really comes up is in violent crime. There's the idea that if you commit violent crime, you become impure and you have to leave the community. And if you don't leave the community and nothing is done to purify this, like you leaving the community is the community purifying itself. But if nothing like that is done, the community gets stained, and the stain stays with the community or with your family, for instance, and this can bring the wrath of the gods or of the people or of the spirits that want to be avenged, right? So there's this idea that impurity is also a situation that makes you vulnerable to divine wrath or wrath of spirits, right? The Furies or something. And in the Phaedrus, we saw Plato mention this, right? So he mentions um, how madness is one of the positive things about madness. Madness can provide relief from the greatest plagues of trouble that beset certain families because of their guilt for ancient crimes. It turns up among those who need a way out. It gives prophecies and takes refuge in prayers to the gods and in worship, discovering mystic rites and purifications that bring the man it touches through to safety for this and all hard time to come. So it is that the right sort of madness finds relief from present hardships for a man it has possessed. So here, the idea that there's one kind of inspiration from the gods that's about finding solutions for this kind of pollution, right? And sometimes people themselves have it, but other times, there's like a plague going on in the city, and then you go to a seer, you go to an oracle and ask, "What's up? What's going on?" The oracle tells you, "You've upset so and so. You need to sacrifice this and do that." Right? And so that's the background. Now, this kind of purification doesn't always have a good reputation in Plato because so this is in Republic Book 2. Adeimantus brings it against this series of arguments where it's problematic. Why? Because these priests, they go around telling people, don't worry, if you've committed some injustice and so on, the gods are angry, but for a fee, we can purify you, and then the injustice is gone, right? And so they say that the gods too assign misfortune, a bad life to many good people, and the opposite fate to their opposites. Begging priests and prophets frequent the doors of the rich and persuade them that they possess a God-given power found on sacrifice and incantations. If the rich person or any of his ancestors has committed injustice, they can take it off him. Some people will quote Homer for this, right? The gods themselves can be swayed by prayer and with sacrifices and soothing promises. Incense and libations, human beings turn them from their purpose when someone has transgressed and sinned. And they present a noisy throng of books by Musaeus and Orpheus, right? Orphics are accused of doing this kind of trade. Offspring, as they say, of Selene and the Muses, in accordance with which they perform their rituals. And they persuade not only individuals, but whole cities that the unjust deeds of the living or the dead can be absolved or purified through ritual sacrifices and pleasant games, right? And so there's this like this criticism of religious purification in Plato, especially the idea that it's a purely external thing. You go through the rituals and then you're purified, but you yourself don't have to change, right? Um, and so we see this in the laws as well. The laws, there's an attempt to, as it were, say that you actually have to be good to for this purification to work. So this is in Laws 4, and at first there's this expression of the view of assimilation to God as an ideal, right? So what conduct recommends itself to God and reflects his wishes, there is only one sort epitomized in the old saying, like approves of like. In our view, it is God who is preeminently the measure of all things, much more so than any man, as they say. So if you want to recommend yourself to someone of this character, you must do your level best to make your own character reflect his. And on this principle, the moderate man is God's friend, being like him, whereas the immoderate and unjust man is not like him and is his enemy. And the same reasoning applies to the other vices too. So this just uh, brings up the idea of likeness to God as being embodied in virtue. But he goes on. Let's be clear that the consequence of all this is the following doctrine. If a good man sacrifices the gods, keeps them constant company in his prayers and offerings, every kind of worship he can give them, this will be the best and noblest policy he can follow. It is a conduct that fits his character as nothing else can, and it is his most effective way of achieving a happy life. But if the wicked man does it, the results are bound to be just the opposite. Whereas the good man's soul is clean, the wicked man's soul is polluted. And it is never right for good man or for God to receive gifts from unclean hands, which means that even if impious people do lavish a lot of attention on the gods, they are wasting their time, whereas the trouble taken by the pious is very much in season. So here he's drawing from the idea that likeness to God requires virtue, precisely the idea that you cannot, as it were, wash yourself of wickedness, wash yourself of injustice. Because any prayer of any kind presupposes that you are pure so you can approach the gods. Right. So um
So
that's a
against the people that he was talking about in the Republic who seem to think that you could buy your way out with money or the correct sacrifice and so on.
exactly. Yeah. In the Phaedo, which becomes for the Neoplatonists later the main text on the life of purification, there's an appropriation of these mystery rites, right? In this famous passage about what's true virtue. My good Simmias, I fear this is not the right exchange to attain virtue, to exchange pleasures for pleasures, pains for pains, and fears for fears. The greater for the less coins, but that the only valid currency for which all these things should be exchanged is wisdom. We'll get back to the passage immediately following, but right, he's criticizing precisely, for instance, that virtue that's talked about in the Protagoras, where the art of measurement will tell you what is truly painful and what is truly pleasurable, and not let you get um, deceived by what is close to you in time and what is distant. And so like you will be moderate because you won't overindulge now because you know that will make you sick and that will bring pain later. Right? And so that's an example of exchanging pleasures for pleasures or pains for pains. With this, we have real courage and moderation and justice, and in a word, true virtue, with wisdom, whether pleasures and fears and all such things be present or absent. When these are exchanged for one another in separation from wisdom, such virtue is only an illusory appearance of virtue. It is in fact fit for slaves, without soundness or truth, whereas in truth, moderation, courage, and justice are purging away of all such things. Wisdom itself is a kind of cleansing or purification. Right? So this is where the um, Neoplatonists get. So there are the four um, virtues of the Republic again: wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. But they're distinct from those that are just about controlling your passions and only having the right, like being angry at the right time in the right way. These are all about separating yourself, purifying yourself of the body and connection with the body. It is likely that those who established the mystic rites for us were not inferior persons. Those who established, of course, he's not talking, there can be crooks nowadays who use them, but those who established them were not inferior persons, but were speaking in riddles long ago when they said that whoever arrives in the underworld uninitiated and unsanctified will wallow in the mire, whereas he who arrives there purified and initiated will dwell with the gods. There are indeed, as those concerned with the mystery say, many who carry the thyrsus, but the Bacchates are few. Right. Bacchant in Greek is literally the Bacchuses, right? The people who get possessed and become, as it were, other Bacchuses, other Dionysuses. Um, these latter are, in my opinion, no other than those who have practiced philosophy in the right way. I have in my life left nothing undone in order to be counted among these as far as possible, as I have been eager to be in every way. Whether my eagerness was right and we accomplished anything we shall, I think, know for certain in a short time, God willing, on arriving yonder. So here, that the same premise that's criticized in the Republic, go through this initiation, and that will get you a good afterlife. He's picking up that image and saying, actually, this is about philosophy, right? And so he can use these images of the mystery rites and initiations in order to talk about philosophy and here but as the true purification, which is becoming uh, becoming separate from your body. This passage, we'll reread it later when we get there, but this passage, there are indeed, as those concerned with the mystery say, many who carry the thesis, but the Bacchants are few. The calling of the philosopher a Bacchant is the context in which Damascus reports to us this division that existed amongst the Platonists. Those who thought philosophy was more important and those who thought theurgy was more important. Right? So this becomes a central text for them to debate about. And important, Damascus in his report, he puts Plotinus on the philosophy section, right? Um, and And so who interpret this passage as saying, the true initiation is the philosophical life. Um, and so, but just to give some the more of the content to what these true virtues are, he previously has this analogy of the philosopher with a person who goes down into Hades, right? So here you have what he achieves there is true knowledge of the forms, right? Not meeting his loved one. Will then a true lover of wisdom, who has a similar hope and knows that he will never find it to any extent except in Hades, be resentful of dying and not gladly undertake the journey thither? One must surely think so, my friend, if he is a true philosopher, for he is firmly convinced that he will not find pure knowledge anywhere except there. If this is so, then, as I said just now, would it not be highly unreasonable for such a man to fear death? It certainly would, by Zeus. So the philosopher, and this is a reason for comparing him with the initiated, he is like Orpheus. Orpheus goes down there to find his beloved, and the philosopher also goes wants to die to find his beloved, wisdom. Then you have sufficient indication, he said, that any man whom you see resenting death was not a lover of wisdom, but a lover of the body, and also a lover of wealth or of honors, or either of both. It is certainly as you say. And Simmias, he said, does not what is called courage belong especially to men of this disposition? Most certainly. So this is like the philosopher is the truly courageous person because he wants to be separated from the body, he is training to die, and that is true courage as opposed to a person who still does not want to die and resents dying, right? Like someone who is like a brave soldier. He's not practicing to die in the way the philosopher is. And then he goes on to talk about moderation and the quality of moderation, which even the majority call by that name, that is not to get swept off one's feet by one's passions, but to treat them with disdain and orderliness. Is this not suited only to those who most of all despise the body and live the life philosophy? Necessarily so, he said. Right. So again, this is the distinction between, so between what the majority say is moderation, which is just as it were precisely what the name says, moderation, just to have them in a moderate, not avoid excess. That's truly achieved by the person who simply separates himself from the passions. He emphasizes that this here. If you are willing to reflect on the courage and moderation of other people, you'll find them strange, right? You definitely know that they all consider death a great evil, and the brave among them face death with when they do with for fear of greater evils, right? So the warrior faces death because he's afraid of, say, what will happen to his city, or because he's afraid of what will happen to his reputation. Therefore, it is fear and terror that make all men brave, except the philosophers. It is because the philosophers are brave, they want to die out of love for philosophy, out of love for wisdom. Yet it is illogical to be brave through fear and cowardice. What of the moderate among them? Is their experience not similar? Is it licentiousness of a kind that makes them moderate? We say this is impossible, yet their experience of this simple-minded moderation turns out to be similar. They fear to be deprived of other pleasures which they desire, so they keep away from some pleasures because they are overcome by others, right? So they avoid overindulging because they're going to get sick, and and they want to avoid that pain, and they want to continue to enjoy their lives.
Hmm.
Now, to be mastered by pleasure is what they call licentiousness. But what happens to them is that they master certain pleasures because they are mastered by others. This is like what we mentioned just now, that in some ways it is the kind of licentiousness that has made them moderate. So this This applies also to like the Republic views on moderation and and bravery, because there again, there's no idea that you are um, as it were, separating yourself from the body. It's just um, making sure that your passions obey reason, obey the soul. And also, there's a distinction here between the Phaedo and the Republic, of their models of the soul, right? So famously, the Republic develops this tripartite model of the soul, right? With the many-headed beast and the thumos and reason. Whereas the Phaedo insists on the simplicity of the soul, which makes it like the forms and then makes it immortal as well. Um, and what but this purity in the sense of separating yourself from the body is in the sense service of knowing the forms, right? And here pure is used just in more that sense of the thing by itself, right? And so here he says, then he will do this
So,
most perfectly who approaches the object with thought alone, without associating any sight with his thought or dragging in any sense perception with his reasoning, but who, using pure thought alone, tries to track down each reality pure and by itself, freeing himself as far as possible from eyes and ears and, in a word, from the whole body. Because the body confuses the soul and does not allow it to acquire the truth and wisdom whenever it is associated with it. And later he talks about it in similar things. While we live, we shall be closest to knowledge if we refrain as much as possible from association with the body and do not join with it more than we must, if we are not infected with its nature, but purify ourselves from it until the God himself frees us in death. In this way, we shall escape the contamination of the body's folly. We shall be likely to be in the company of people of the same kind, and by our own efforts, we shall know all that is pure, which is presumably the truth. For it is not permitted to the impure to attain the pure. All right. So that's um that's a bit the background of purification in uh for Plotinus.
so if I could recap a second, something
Sure.
like this is the picture that I get from Plato here. Um, there is a traditional or religious idea of purification, um, which has like its purity laws and stuff like that. It's somewhat distinct traditionally from morality, both in the way like some just things can still be impure, like the execution of Socrates, and also which he seems to accept maybe, which matches with the Neoplatonic understanding, that it's not enough to be just to be pure. It's another level, although executing Socrates is probably not a good idea. But like even like just execution in general. And on the other hand, there could be ways in which this purificatory rites seem to go against um, virtue in the case of like people that sell you indulgences, right? Things that you can get away for guilt without actually rectifying the guilt or becoming a better person or something like that. And Plato, um, both speaking generally, like in against these second people, will say that that's wrong because I think it goes to the whole idea of the gods being just or justice or the forms, and therefore you can't bribe them, so to speak, and they have to be perfect and so on. And all right, and that also what the whole Thrasymachus thing, where that means that gods are also just about power and so on. Um, and so that's like step one. And the step two is that he then also what you call reappropriates or maybe reinterprets. Like this is a good proof text for Proclus' previous article that we read about Plato
Yeah.
really being the correct interpretation of the traditional rites and stuff, where he says that really what the all the initiation rites and purification means is philosophy somehow. Um, Not really clear how like whatever they used to do is philosophy, but maybe it's like a metaphor or something. I'm not sure. Um, so
Uh,
and that's right. That's the basic story. Then there is the like virtue that comes out of that, right? So this after this reappropriation, I'm just going in this order. Then we turns out something like we have two different versions of what the virtue even is. So we're going back sort of to the first thing, which says that purification is not the same as virtue, unlike what the image you would get maybe in other. Like someone could just say, well, purification just means virtue. No, or civic virtue. It doesn't mean that because we have these like two accounts of virtue, one which is in which moderation means the simple thing, which is being balanced, and then the Phaedo has this other whole story where purification really means philosophy or really like becoming like God in the sense of living forever, in the sense of becoming your soul, which is immortal, and that is accomplished by like philosophy itself, like the I guess the practice of the thought, and there is like philosophical virtue or philosophical morals which are, so to speak, a lot more extreme, or a lot more ascetic than what the Republic demands of you, which is just to be balanced. You need to both know the truth, and somehow, in order to know the truth, or in order to become kin to the truth, you need to like entirely not believe in the body and all the things of it. Is that
yeah, that's a good summary. And also, I'll add something that I neglected to point out in the first run, which is both. So Plato in his like in the Phaedo, he's he's using the fact that there is in already like available to him this idea that you need something more than virtue, right? So that you need so like even if you're not say if you even if you're not an initiate, even if you're not say a participant in Orphic mysteries, then um you if you're a participant and an Athenian citizen, you can think that you need to do more than just be a good citizen and just be a good person, because, for instance, it could be that the city has done something in the past that brought a stain on it, and then that's going to cause tragedy later, right? Or it's not, maybe not the city, someone in your family, or you'll do this, right? So, like, it's not enough for you just to, for instance, the answer to wrongdoing is not just enough to reform your character, become a better person, don't make the same mistake again. There's also this question that serious wrongdoing brings with it pollution, and therefore is something you need to be more than virtuous. You need to be virtuous and also pure, right? And so
Mhm.
Plato is using this to say, see, it's not enough for you to just have this kind of uh, courage and moderation that are just exchanges of pleasures for pleasures. You need also true virtue, right? And so he's using that too. And it's not something that's just present, say, in Athens. Also in the Republic, there's a like an acknowledgement of this passage that I don't have a slide for, but he has this passage there where he says that actually the most important laws are going to be the laws about temples and sacrifices and and things like that, and they're going to leave those laws for Apollo to decide, right? And so like there's this nod that there's another level, and of course it's those laws that are going to take care of this problem, right? It's those laws that are going to say you can't bribe an oracle and things like that, and you can't just pay for a purification. So so there's also a nod in the Republic that you need something more. So that's
Okay.
the background. And now Plotinus is gonna, as it were, kind of like fill out this.
Okay.
Um,
And a Christian way or something would say that since there's original sin, then everyone has a stain and it's not enough to be virtuous. You need something else.
Yes, and also Christians, I forget exactly the genealogy of this, but um, moment. My computer has said it. Okay. But the Christians later developed this, also adopt this idea that there's a purgative life and a contemplative life and a life of unification. And we'll see that these three steps come from the three steps of the purificatory virtues, contemplative virtues, theurgic virtues. If I
Hmm.
remember correctly, it's Proclus through Pseudo Dionysus, goes to Albertus Magnus, and then spreads. Um,
Okay.
but
There's like one traditional thing which is like some people would say, like Plato has already, that maybe a person who is morally compromised, the gods won't accept his sacrifice, which is not the same thing as saying that the sacrifice is itself like a different level of purification. It's like still has the sacrifice being just some magic, like Thrasymachus things, but like there's a condition or something like that.
right, yeah. Um, so so let's turn now to paragraph three. Or to
Okay. So we come now, chapter 3 or whatever.
yeah, chapter
We
three.
come now to that other mode of likeness, another mode of likeness, other than the civic virtue, which is likeness by the measure, which we read is the fruit of the loftier virtues. So there's like a text that says that somewhere. Not sure which. Discussing this, we shall penetrate more deeply into the essence of the civic virtue and be able to define the nature of the higher kind whose existence we shall establish beyond doubt.
Yeah, so the the higher likeness is or like which text he's specifically thinking of. He might have been thinking of that the Phaedo text that we saw. He might be thinking of the Theaetetus, right, which talks about having to flee this world, and he contrasts that with the old wives' tales. So, I mean, but both of those are possible. He might be thinking of the laws text as well that we saw.
Hmm.
Um, right.
Okay.
Um,
And this will somehow help us both know this higher likeness and understand these civic virtues.
yes.
Um, okay. To Plato, unmistakably, there are two distinct orders of virtue, and the civic does not suffice for likeness. Likeness to God, he says, this is the Theaetetus text, is a flight from the world's ways and things.
Mhm.
Now, in dealing with the qualities of good citizenship, it does not use the simple term virtue, but adds the distinguishing word civic or political, I guess. And elsewhere, he declares all virtues without exception to be purifications. So
Right.
those are talking
So
about two different kinds of virtues, like in general, or
yeah,
one kind of all virtues, which is a different kind, I guess, are the ones that are
yeah,
purifications, and the civic virtues are a specific kind of virtue.
right. We saw a couple of passages like this last time, like where Plato says in the Republic, "Oh, we've defined courage. Let's say we've defined civic courage." Right. Things like that.
Hmm. But in what sense can we call the virtues purifications? And how does purification issue in likeness? So these are two questions. How are virtues purifications? And what does purification got to do with likeness?
Right.
So, as the soul is evil by being interfused with the body, and by coming to share the body's states and to think the body's thoughts, that happens by the soul's mixing with the body, so to speak. Um,
Right. The passages from the Phaedo. Right?
so it would be good. So it would be good. It would be. I don't understand. It would be possessed of virtue. Oh, it would be good or and possessed of virtue if it threw off the body's moods and devoted itself to its own act, which is the act of intellection and wisdom, though that's his own act. Never allowed the passions of the body to affect it, which is the virtue or like the second character, the philosophical virtue of sophrosyne or temperance. And you will know no fear at the parting of the body, which is the virtue of fortitude or courage, in right in the purificatory sense. And if reason and the intellectual principle ruled without opposition, in which state is righteousness?
Right. That would be justice. Yeah.
Okay, it's not the same as wisdom. Here, like wisdom is the general thing, and justice is like one thing. Not sure.
So here, um, wisdom. So it's like in the Republic, right? Wisdom is the virtue of reason, and justice is all the parts doing what they should. So here, wisdom is that the soul is entirely engaged in its own activity. It's not doing any engaged in bodily activities. Whereas justice is that there is no opposition to this activity of the soul.
Hmm. Okay, which is something like the
Right. So it's distinct. The Republic version is obedience, and here there's no opposition. Right. So this is, as it were, more negative than.
right. It's very similar to temperance, like the logical part ruling over everything else, and then here it's
Right. Whereas here it's never allow the passions of the body to
justice.
affect it. Yeah. It is true that those things are similar, and it's actually a feature of. I mean, here he'll just as it I think he'll just as like one more level, but as you go up the hierarchy, the virtues come closer to each other and they come to uh, resemble each other more, and the distinctions become more just as it were irrational distinctions.
Right. We end up in this like very big simplification where good is just the soul or wisdom, and ungood is just a reason or everything else, the body.
Right.
Um, okay, so such a this, and then like somehow we reinterpret. I'm not sure if what that's supposed like reinterpret all the like traditional virtues as just meaning that, because somehow we could somehow make everything boil down to that because like Socrates kind of argument like if you were to have real courage means not caring about your body at all, which is real courage only in like very like capital sense real, like not real courage that anyone else means by courage. Like
I
maybe it will help you practice the things of courage, but it's not courage. Like the virtue of courage is like it turns out to be an intellectual virtue. Like Aristotle would tell you that courage and all these things they need to be in this like middle part of the soul, which is halfway is reasonable, and now it's not that. So
Yeah, but I'm thinking like in terms of behavior, the for instance, let's take like a courageous activity of say you know running into a burning building to save someone. And the person who is has the intellect, like the purificatory version of this, of courage, would also do that. I mean, they would also, um, they say, I don't care if I die. So, um, they do that, as would the person with the civic version of that. Um, the one with the purificatory version would actually put them more themselves perhaps more often at risk, right? Because, for instance, the person who's like a firefighter and who's part of the polis and he has the political version of this, they're constantly eating well and keeping themselves in shape so that when they need to do this, they'll be able to do it well. Whereas the person who has the purificatory version is, they're fasting often and they have this sort of really limited diet because and and then they, of course, they wouldn't be that able
Hmm.
to help, although they might be more disposed, but they would be less able and but, they'd actually have a more fragile health than the firefighter, and in that sense, they do put themselves more at risk. Um,
Right, but you gotta, so it ends up not being the same exact activities. Like
yeah,
you, and it's somewhat more extreme. Or
yeah, it's somewhat more extreme, but I mean, you can see similarities and differences. It's not just a
I mean, but then right, but then like someone like, I mean, if the virtue is always a mean, if Plato doesn't really go all the way back that, you would say, well, then you're bad in that sense. This is a contradiction that we get like for Aristotle's contemplative life versus the political life. Or like there are some things that you must do for the normal meaning of virtues, um, but you're not allowed to do for the, well, he doesn't have this whole thing, but we're not, if you would be the philosophical version, then you would, like you said, like you would have to eat less and then could not be a good citizen, maybe.
right, or you wouldn't be as good a citizen. And um, right, this then, yeah, there can be a back and forth, and then you say, you're not a good citizen. Like, if we go to war, we can't really count on you because, you just spend your whole life studying. And then the answer is something like, okay, what's like um what are you actually trying to be in being a good citizen? You're just trying to be an image of what I am. And
Right.
I think that's the comeback. This is supposed to be a simulation to God. I'm doing it better.
Right.
Um,
It's still somewhat like bad from the perspective of the uh
right. And I guess it's also part of the thing is like, okay, you can win the war, but like you survived the war, you defended yourself, but people died, pollution happened, and so you're gonna need pure people to help purify you. And and because otherwise it's gonna be worse for the city, because then there's gonna be more punishment, more vengeance from the gods.
hmm. Okay.
Um,
Okay, we'll stop there then. Um we're gonna get stuck here. Um it's so we're not yeah. Um um
right. So this is the
such a
answer.
disposition, where am I? So it would not be wrong. So let's finish this paragraph here. Such a disposition in the soul, meaning this, like this righteousness, maybe like this second kind of righteousness and everything, become thus intellective and immune to passion. It would not be wrong to call likeness to God, for the divine too is pure, and the divine act is such that likeness to it is wisdom.
Right. Um, the so here this the idea, the divine is pure is almost um analytic, but right, you have to be pure in order to have intercourse with the divine. But it also has to do with the idea that the divine things are separate from this world, right?
Mm.
And you're more like that by being separate from the body. The disposition here is not just the last thing; it's all these virtues, right? And so he answered here two questions, right? The first is, in what sense can we call the virtues purifications? That was the first section, going through each virtue and showing how it can be a purification. And how does the purification issue in likeness, right? Well, it's because the divine is pure, and the divine act is such that likeness to it is wisdom.
Okay,
Um,
so let me then, maybe there's a the other way around. Maybe something like, because these virtues can be read as purification, so maybe practicing the civic virtues will make you at least somewhat more pure.
Right. Yes.
Like if you have regular courage, then at least you're not entirely beholden to the body's will to live or something.
Exactly. Because you do set limits to it. You say like there are certain situations in which it's better not to live, for instance.
Right, and so you're a little bit separate from the body, and now, and this is like God in a different way. Like before, the civic virtues just are themselves are like God in the way that they're a measure, so they have more form, and in this way they're like God. Somewhat in this, they're akin to the separateness of the God itself. Like
Mm.
because they're separating themselves from the lower things, but they are like the God which is separate from the lower things.
Right. So in the first thing, you're assimilating yourself to the intelligibility of the God, to its to how it is ideally a form, and then but these then assimilate you to presumably something higher about the God, which is its separation. Right.
It's like higher, or it's how is it higher? No,
Well, one way to think about this is also that I mean, if we want to think about this, it's also that they assimilate you to different gods. By being completely ordered, you become like the world, which is completely ordered, or maybe the world soul, which is completely ordered and wise, and so on. But the world soul is still tied to the world,
okay.
to the world's body. However, by becoming separate, you become like nous, which creates the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And which can be the cause of form because it is of form in matter because it is independent of matter.
All right. But we did have this whole thing which with nous or even like the demiurgic nous being creating by being separate or something where
Right.
so it's not I mean that would be the second level. Because you would
Oh,
still have some like we have this whole thing I don't know where the divine causes don't mix in with the things they cause of even while causing them or in the same way in which they cause them.
right. And so right, but then it would be a different kind of causation. So like even, the ascetic is a source of order, although not the way that I don't know, the king is or the politician is.
Hmm.
So um and he's a source of order for other people as say as a model, as a teacher, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the um, um, it shows that life can be otherwise, and you don't really need it. It's like, oh, maybe we don't need to drink coffee every day. Look, the monks down the street, they don't do that.
Mm.
Um, and whereas the politician is a source of order by, he himself is part of the city and setting laws and things like that, right?
Okay. Or like maybe something that Rambam says where his like ultimate politician or a philosopher prophet is like God because he doesn't have virtues, or that's what he says, because God has no attributes. So he says he's like God because when the ideal king utilizes anger or love or any of these things, he doesn't really feel any of these. He's not moved. He's just doing it for some rational reason, but he's not mad at the person he kills or happy with the person he rewards. It's just some kind of rational thing, and that's like a way in which like that's not a normal way of normally when we talk about like following God's ways, it means something like do the things that he does, which are the things in the world that he does, right? The activities.
Right.
And but then like for the ideal ruler, he has this idea of you will follow God by not doing anything, which is really not being anything, not being moved, just similar to this.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I think not sure you can be in Plotinus, at least. I'm not sure you can still be, as it were, king and develop these. Or virtues. I guess you could. Then you do, yeah, you just emit your edicts, as you say, without passion. This person has to die because it's the law that they die. So, but we're not angry at them or anything like that. Yeah.
Right.
Um, mm,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, but then he here he goes further and calls that like courage and stuff like that. Um,
Then he,
um, or
right,
like you
yeah,
say, the regular courage. There's like that's why there's two directions. There's one direction in which like the regular courage might lead to that, and the other one is after you're a philosopher, then you have a new. Maybe there's a courage that comes out of that, of the knowledge that the the body is not important and so on.
yeah.
Or I mean, in the apology, Socrates says that you shouldn't be afraid of death because we just don't know what happens and
Right.
be rational.
That doesn't seem to be the Phaedo version. Oh,
Right.
yeah.
Um, that might be like a negative thing. Like you at least don't know that the body is that important or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, okay. But so that's the answer to this. But then we go to the other question that we had, which is the thing that we are akin to also having the virtue. But with this, would not this make virtue a state of the divine also? So which
Right.
virtue? The
So just if the separation and become and being entirely devoted to intellection, if this is virtue, then I mean it seems like that nous, which is separate from everything and is entirely an act, it seems that it has virtue.
right. But then it says, no, the divine has no states. The state is in the soul. Why? The act of intellection in the soul is not the same as in divine. Of things in the supreme, one, the intellectual principle, has a different mode of intellection from that of the soul. The other, the absolute one, has none at all. Oh, I didn't really say anything here.
Um, right. So um, he he just said that he said no. Why? Because no way to intellect means different things in each one. Um, what can this mean? Um, so to have into intellect, to intelligize, in the soul is an act that it can engage in or not, right? And so for it to be in a state of wisdom is for it to be somehow disposed in a certain way, right? The and it's a realization of a potentiality that might not be realized. It's like right. So again, it's like sight. It's a potentiality that we can use or not. We're subjects of knowledge. The intellect, however, when it knows, when it intelligizes, it is like the sun, right? And so the saying that nous is like has virtue is like saying that the sun is awake and has its eyes opened. I guess that's the idea. It's so there it seems so I mean that's the best I can do here. The um and so in that way to the degree that it's wrong to say that the sun is awake and has its eyes open, so also it's wrong to say that it has wisdom as a virtue.
hmm So we would say something like, maybe something like, if we talk about separation, which we were talking about a second ago, now we changed it to intellection. Um, we would say something like the nous is separate, but it's not separated because it was never not separate.
Yeah,
But the
we
soul, or
could
at
do
least
that.
the person, is sometimes not separate. But that means that also when it is, it's kind of a different kind of thing. I mean, often we said that, right? The difference between soul and intellect is that the soul thinks in time what intellect is all at once or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yes. That's one.
That's sort of the same.
Right. That's one of the distinctions. So there's it's you can think of it as like also sometimes people ask like, it's just his nature to be patient. It's not even a virtue for that person to be patient because that's just who they are. I mean, that's just their
Hmm.
nature. They're just built like that. There's no effort involved for them. Here he's saying something stronger, right? Because it's not even that, like there's no effort. The person doesn't cost the noose anything to do this, but it's just natural, right? And um for it. And so it's not technically a virtue. Virtue is, as it were, likeness. I mean, it goes back to this question about that there are two kinds of likeness, right? And virtue is likeness of the copy. And so even so um the original doesn't have that kind of likeness because it belongs to the original primarily. And so it's wrong to say that the original is disposed in that way. Um, does that make sure sense?
Somewhat. I just that if I just summarize something like we had two kinds of likeness. Um, right, the civic virtue one and the purificatory virtue one, and what we have is both of these are like. One is more like than the other, or maybe like a higher principle or like a higher part of a principle aspect or something. And both are also unlike, meaning to say they're all, or like you said, they're both like, but there's something in which the things that they're like is not the same, because then they would be identical. So they're both like, but not identical. Um,
Right.
and the way they're both not identical in sort of the same way. Is that true? Um, although he says different words, but they seem to be the same thing in the end. Like I mean, not entirely the same way, but like because we're speaking about different things, but like the order
So,
or measure that we have is like the measure there, but there it's not a measure of something. Um,
right.
while our measure is a measure of matter, so it's like an unmattered measure or form, participated form. Um, in the same way, the separateness of us is a separateness from something. But the divine is not separate from anything. I mean, he is, but it's not in itself that it's separate from something. It's the things that are different from it. So it's not like
Right.
separate from something. It's separate in itself. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. So yeah, so our order is an order of, whereas that is just order. And our separation is separation from, where that is actually just uh, subsisting in itself, right? And not having separated from something, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Like a simple way of saying it was that would be that since he cannot be defiled, it cannot be pure either. And the
Right. That
of
would be a good.
purity is something that can be, although purity is being like the thing that is undefiled, it's still different.
Yeah. So he'll to his way of making this clearer is that is talking about primary and secondary about images. So you can finish reading just the
Okay, so let's finish yet again. The one word intellection covers two distinct acts. Rather, there is primal intellection. So it's not these, then they like asking, so then there are two different things. So why are we even calling it the same word? So in other words, it's not like, so it is like. Rather, there is primal intellection, and there is intellection deriving from the primal and of other scope. As speech is the echo of thought in the soul, so thought in the soul is an echo from elsewhere. That is to say, as the uttered thought is an image of the soul thought, so the soul thought images a thought above itself and is the interpreter of the higher sphere. Virtue, in the same way, is a thing of the soul, does not belong to the intellectual principle or to the transcendence. To the one.
right to Uh, to the transcendence, yeah, to what is beyond. Yeah, that would be the one. Yeah. So,
So this
so
thing
he
with
uses
thought being an echo from speech, something like, I have to think about that more. Does that make
right.
sense with what we usually think about the soul versus thought, right? Thought is like, no, soul is something like giving words to a thought. The thought can be all at once, but the
Right.
words have to be separate. The words are somehow then mattered in some way. They can be otherwise, and so on.
Yeah. That's it's a common illustration in Plotinus, also in his treatise on providence. He uses this image of speaking of the spoken word a lot. The spoken word as opposed to the interior word. Um, okay, so we made it. We can come back to the thoughts and speech next time.
Hmm.
But basically next time we'll do four, and that will be next week on the 9th.
I think so. I think so.
Okay,
Just check.
great.
Mm. I sent you a thing. Did you?
You did. I got it.
Yeah.
I got it. Thanks.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.